Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Deborah Garlick, and today's session is what is PMDD and how can you support it in the workplace? And I'm delighted to welcome my wonderful colleague, Sally Leech, who is a director of Henpicked. And Sally, I'm sure you talk about this every single day. You could talk about PMDD, probably even in your sleep. You see so many sessions that we run about menstruation every single day. And so I know that this is a topic that you are really passionate about everybody understanding. But we don't all understand this, Sally, and actually it's full of myths and misunderstandings, as is a lot around the topic of menstruation and menstrual health. So we are adding menstruation into the mix of menopause and women's health. And so really we want to be seeing us covering off all of those menstrual health subjects over time. But I'm actually going to start with the basics here today, Sally.
Yeah,
So, for anyone who's new to this, what exactly is PMDD?
fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Really delighted to be here. It's lovely to be on session with our amazing audience within the Henpicked community. So, in terms of what PMDD is, PMDD stands for Premenstrual Dysphoric Disorder. So, it may be a term some of you have heard of, it may not be. And it's considered to be a severe form of premenstrual syndrome, PMS. And it's considered to cause really significant physical, emotional, and psychological symptoms. And those symptoms occur during what's called the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle. So this is the second half of the menstrual cycle from ovulation up to when someone has their periods. And normally subsides quite dramatically when someone starts their periods or just after their periods have started. And to me, that's so important that we understand some of the terminology around the stages of the menstrual cycle because it helps us understand what could be causing or the challenges that people are facing. So understanding that luteal phase is that second half of the menstrual cycle. And often in terms of actually how PMDD is experienced, it can be really very different from one person to the next. There's thought to be some kind of almost like subtypes of PMDD. So some people may have their symptoms from all the way from ovulation to when their periods start. Some may have some symptoms around ovulation and then again just before their periods start. Or some may experience a real acceleration of symptoms. So they start around ovulation and they increase in severity and impact in that time in the run up to when someone's period starts. So that gives an overview of what PMDD is.
What PMDD is? And you actually went into quite a bit of detail there about the different stages during our menstrual cycle. And so many of us who had the education at school, well, actually, the education I had in school was probably more towards how not to get pregnant rather than understanding the different stages of the menstruation cycle. But PMDD, this is one that you talk about a lot because more and more people feel that they're experiencing it. So, how is it different? Because many of us know the term PMS, premenstrual syndrome. Many of us understand that. How is that different to PMDD?
Yes, it's a really interesting, quite complex subject. So we use the term PMS to talk about symptoms relating to menstruation, and it's kind of a generic term we use. But in terms of from a clinical point of view, premenstrual syndrome, PMS, refers to the symptoms that occur during the luteal phase of the menstrual cycle, typically the week or two before menstruation. Symptoms have an impact on physical, emotional, and behavioral aspects and can really vary in intensity from person to person. Whereas PMDD is a very specific set of symptoms that are considered to be the kind of real psychological, psychiatric symptoms. And we'll come on to talk about that. But according to the NHS, PMS affects up to 30% of women and girls and people who menstruate. But when you read some of the other data around 70 to 80% of people report experiencing symptoms relating to menstruation, but it's not classed as PMS because it's not defined or diagnosed in terms of the definition of what PMS is. And the challenge is that really now premenstrual syndromes are referring to a spectrum of mood and physical symptoms occurring during that luteal phase. And even things like the National Association of Premenstrual Syndrome actually changed their name to the National Association of Premenstrual Syndromes to really recognize the range of symptoms and syndromes that people can be experiencing, including PMDD. And the challenge around that is you've got things like the American Psychiatric Association, who define PMDD. You've got the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, who focus more on PMS. And these are then infiltrated into the way these are defined and determined through the NHS and through things like the National Association, or NAPS, the National Association of Premenstrual Syndromes. And then WHO, the World Health Organization, referring it as premenstrual tension syndrome. And from a clinical point of view, there's a real concern that some of the terminology makes it really difficult for people to define exactly what's going on, getting access to the right treatment, conditions not really being taken seriously, whether that's by people generally in society or by medical professionals. And also because there's a real strict criteria, which we can come on to talk around the diagnosis of PMDD, some people could be experiencing quite severe symptoms that aren't clinically diagnosed as PMDD, so finding it then hard to access the treatments. So from a clinical point of view, the consensus is that if PMS symptoms affect physical, psychological, social, and economic well-being, then it should be regarded as clinically significant PMS, warranting diagnosis, appropriate recognition, and evidence-based medical care. So it's a confusing area, and it goes on to talk, when we talk about how we manage this, the tracking of symptoms and getting really specific about what's going on makes such a difference to be able to define actually what's happening for somebody.
Well, and I've probably come back to how many sessions do we run when people say they're experiencing this or they're experiencing that, and they've just put it down to it's just my periods, or maybe they've been to see a doctor about it, and it's just like, well, that's what you've got to put up with when you're a woman. Yet nobody really knows what normal looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is the whole challenge around the kind of misdiagnosis or misunderstanding of a lot of menstrual health conditions, because we don't talk about menstruation, we don't talk about what, as you say, and I don't like using the word normal, but what is abnormal in terms of people experiencing severe pain, people experiencing severe psychological distress, which is what PMDD sufferers can really experience, and it can be very extreme in some cases, or people experiencing, severe bleeding, heavy pain. It very much shows that if we can normalize the conversation around this and actually recognize people shouldn't be putting up with severe pain, severe psychological distress, they shouldn't be putting up with severe bleeding or other things that are maybe part of other menstrual health conditions. This is very much the more we can understand and recognize that isn't what should be normal, that actually then people can feel more confident advocating for themselves and getting the help and support, because there are loads of ways we can manage these conditions, but we need to understand them first.
Oh, woman on a mission, Sally Leech.
Absolutely.
And we're all with you there, Sally. And back to PMDD, the myths and misunderstandings. What are some of the common myths and misunderstandings around PMDD?
Yes, there are a lot, and I think we'll, especially when we start to talk around treatment and diagnosis, some of that will come out through that as well. But firstly, PMDD is not just about having bad periods, and I think that is the same statement around many menstrual health conditions. It's not just a bad period. There is something fundamentally that is going on in the body that is causing a big impact for somebody. I think the biggest myth is around the impact of hormones. So PMDD is not about hormonal imbalance. It's not about having too much or too little of any hormones. People who have PMDD have what's suspected to be an increased sensitivity to the natural changes and fluctuations that occur in the menstrual cycle. So it's a severe negative reaction in the brain in that natural rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone. So it's not about having a deficiency or a lack of, it's the way the brain responds to those fluctuations and changes. I think another couple of things that are myths around it is it's rare. And although when we say around or as many as 5.5% of people, or women, girls, people who menstruate have PMDD, that may sound like a small percentage, but that's potentially over 200 million women and girls and people who menstruate who are affected globally. It's a big population with very significant symptoms. And I think the other one that's really important to think about in terms of a myth around this is around what are some of the symptoms of PMDD. They are very much the psychological and psychiatric symptoms. So and a myth that's often held is you'll still have like heavy bleeding, painful periods. That is normally a sign that there is something else that's going on. So another menstrual health condition, and it is very common for people to have a combination of menstrual health conditions rather than just one on its own. But in terms of what is PMDD, it's very much about those psychological and psychiatric symptoms.
Okay, so why do you think it's so often misdiagnosed or missed?
Well, I think some of it is down to what we've been talking about in terms of we don't talk about it. We normalize period pain, we normalize period discomfort or challenges around menstruation. So people don't reach out and ask for help and support, don't have that diagnosis and support around what's going on. So I think that that's part of it. Or people getting dismissed, very, very common, as you say, when they go and see their healthcare professional. We've got so many quotes from people to say that they talk to their GP, their healthcare practitioner, and there's no recognition or understanding or knowledge of what PMDD is, and we know that's a real challenge. One of the challenges around diagnosis is sometimes people will get misdiagnosed with bipolar when they have PMDD, and I think it's good for us to understand. And this quote I've got from somebody who lives with PMDD to explain how it feels to them. We can maybe understand where that comes from. So someone that shared with us to say the best way for me to describe it is that once a month I decide to press my own self-destruct button and literally let my life, my normally very happy and satisfying life, implode around me. Then when the dark thoughts are lifted and completely cleared, I spend the next 2 weeks trying to pick up the pieces. So there is very much people talk about feeling like two different people in the different halves of their menstrual cycle. And that is where sometimes that diagnosis of bipolar can come from. So again, this is why it's so important that people really track and look at this in relation to their menstrual cycle.
So, an interesting one of the questions that's just come in, very hot. Thank you very much, Precious. Is around how to get help from your GP. What type of support can the GP offer to support people?
Yeah, so there's lots of support in terms of ways of managing and treating PMDD. I think one of the first challenges is actually diagnosing. If we could maybe talk about that a little bit first, and then we can talk around what it might look like to go and ask for help and support. Because to make a diagnosis of PMDD, some symptoms must be present only in the 2 weeks before menstruation, and they must subside a few days after starting the period. So that's a really important point in the diagnosis of PMDD is in that luteal phase. So that's that tracking of symptoms becomes a real priority. But specifically to meet the criteria for PMDD, you must experience at least one of the following. So feeling very irritable or angry, feeling very down or depressed, feeling very anxious, stressed or tense, and avoiding usual activities. In addition to one of those four core mood symptoms, you then need to have any from the following to make a total of five. So this already feels quite confusing. So the following, the other symptoms that could be included: difficulty concentrating, feeling tired, very low in energy, binge eating or having a really strong specific food craving, sleeping too much, having trouble falling asleep, feeling overwhelmed or out of control. And then sometimes people do get some physical symptoms and things like breast tenderness, bloating, body aches, and weight gain. So to be diagnosed, you have to have five in total of those symptoms, and one of them has to be the top four mood symptoms. And as I said, one of the key things is about the diagnosis is that you shouldn't have those symptoms apart from in the 2 weeks before the period, your period. And from a clinical point of view, it would be considered to be not PMDD if someone has symptoms, those kind of symptoms outside of that 2 weeks. What can sometimes be confusing here is that somebody could have an underlying mood disorder, but it can be reactive and exacerbated by the menstrual cycle. So if somebody's experiencing symptoms throughout their whole menstrual cycle, but they're noticing an increase in symptoms in that luteal phase, that second half, it's what's called premenstrual exacerbation. So this is where the menstrual cycle is exacerbating another condition. And it's really important that we get that diagnosis specific, because treatment options for another mood disorder against treatment options for PMDD may be different. So one of the biggest things that people can do to get the best from talking to their GP, their healthcare practitioner, first of all, is that tracking, but tracking of symptoms against the menstrual cycle. That's the key thing to understand where they're coming, where those symptoms are coming in that menstrual cycle. And this can be done through a diary, through a daily journal, through apps. But it's getting really specific around how is this showing up for somebody every single day.
That's
The
fascinating. Unlike when we're doing menopause and you're sort of looking at it as what you're experiencing generally, it's where it comes in the cycle as well. So you have got that multi-level to it, the symptoms and when.
Yeah, the when is really important for it being identified and diagnosed as PMDD. And that's a real important criteria. And it is the GP would normally ask for the tracking of those symptoms to be over at least 2 menstrual cycles. So again, being prepared to be able to take that time to track that over a couple of months, because that's how they can clinically diagnose PMDD. It's frustrating because it can sometimes feel like it takes a really long time. But if you think if you're suspecting this is something that you're going through, then sorry, excuse me. Um, yeah, if you expect this is something that you could be going through, then actually taking that time to really track those symptoms is really, really important in preparation before going to see the GP, because you've got that level of information to be able to share with them. When you do go and see your GP, normally they will want to look at the symptoms tracking, but they'll also want to look at your medical history. So they may look to understand if there's been any past mental health issues, things around your lifestyle. They may also do some physical exams and tests, because it's important they understand is there anything else that's going on, and particularly if there's any deficiencies in nutrients like vitamin D or B12 or B6 or anything like that that could be also causing some of these symptoms. And then often it may need then a referral to a specialist. So it could be a gynecologist, or it could be a mental health specialist for further evaluation and treatment. So it can be a slow process, but I think the key things in terms of getting the most from talking to your healthcare practitioner is reading up about PMDD, so you feel confident in your knowledge. Is some information on the NHS site, but also there's a great charity called the PMDD Project, which we can include in the article. They've got some really great resources that are really useful for understanding more about it. Preparing that the symptoms tracking and a clear picture of what's going on, and then thinking about what treatment options you want to be able to explore, and some questions if the GP starts talking, or your healthcare practitioner you see starts talking around treatment options, really starting to question why they're recommending that treatment for you. How does that fit with your priorities? What are the potential side effects? What are the alternatives? So then you can make an informed decision around whether the treatment's right for you, because some of the treatments around PMDD can be quite significant and have other implications. So we need to be really mindful of making the right decision for each individual.
Thank you very much, Sally. And I might come back to the beginning here, because when you said about advocating for yourself, does come to awareness and education. I know our menstruation friendly members love the packs and feel like they're on a voyage of discovery, because how many times do we hear in our training sessions? I've experienced that for years. I always thought that that was okay, but now I'm listening to this, and actually there is something I can do about it. That raising awareness and the education and feeling confident, being able to say, actually, I think I need some extra support here, takes time.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it's hard, especially if you think about the symptoms of PMDD and how the huge impact this can have for somebody in that second half of their menstrual cycle. To then have the confidence, the resilience to be able to advocate for yourself with a healthcare practitioner who may not be particularly open to having discussions around something like PMDD, it can be really hard. And so the preparation piece, but also asking for help and support within your own network. So whether that's friends or family, sometimes we've seen people have shared they've taken their partner with them to a GP appointment to actually help to explain it and talk about how this is showing up for that person to really demonstrate this is a really severe challenge. We've got some quotes. There was a really interesting BBC article interview piece around people sharing their PMDD experiences. Again, we can share a link in the article. And this was the real lived experience of people. Someone said, I had to tell the crisis team 17 times what was going on before they'd help me. Or I was told it was just PMS. They don't know what causes it, so can't really help. I just told them I was feeling suicidal. So that is the severity of this. And it's why anything we can do to raise awareness is really important, because if anyone is experiencing those kind of thoughts or feelings, we need to ensure they're getting the right help and support. And if anyone joining the session, anyone that you know needs that help and support, ensuring they are reaching out to their crisis team within the healthcare professionals, but also places like Samaritans, so that people aren't experiencing those really extreme symptoms of PMDD without getting the help and support they need.
Thank you very much, Sally. A very interesting question. Can you develop PMDD, or is it something you get from the get-go? Do we know?
We don't know, but what's quite interesting in some of the research is that it doesn't necessarily just start when somebody has their periods. There can be different things that might trigger that throughout somebody's life, and that can be anything from trauma to changes in someone's menstrual cycle to other menstrual health conditions to going through a pregnancy. There can be lots of different things potentially that can trigger. So PMDD isn't just something that you start having when you first go through puberty. For some, it can be, but actually it can develop at another time in life. And that's why it's so important we're really aware of our own bodies, and we notice when things change or when things don't feel right for us or things feel different or things are feeling really hard. Because if they're feeling really hard, it's normally an indication there's something going on that we need to maybe understand more about what's causing that and then how we get the right help and support.
And I guess the question about whether it's hereditary.
Again, there's no specific um, conclusion around this or consensus around this. I think sensitivity to hormones, there is some research saying that there could be a link, if one person in a family experiences a real sensitivity to hormones, then that may be the same for another member of the family, but there's no conclusive evidence around that. It's about that individual experience. And so it's really important to say we know our own bodies and we really listen to our own bodies.
And we are on the voyage of discovery here because, as it's been pointed out a couple of times in the chat now, there is still inequality around women's health, unfortunately. And where do we come in the G20? We are at the bottom, aren't we, in terms of women's health? So absolutely, but we don't have to wait till somebody decides to start influencing the G20. The message I'm getting from you is that we can do a lot to help ourselves.
We can, yeah. I think, as I say, firstly, being educated on what it is and recognizing it either in yourself or someone that you care about is a really big thing. And then also ensuring we are thinking about ways of managing this. And there are lots of different treatments available. They do need to be tailored to each individual. And just again from the BBC thing that the BBC program that I talked about, people have been through, having to really fight for treatment that feels right for them. So someone said that they had to fight for an operation as someone couldn't understand why they were wanting a hysterectomy at 38, but they said that they know their treatment and surgery have 100% saved their lives. But also, somebody said that now I have my life back. So if anyone is struggling, please reach out as there is help and support available. Because there are ways of managing PMDD in terms of if we think around what's causing this. So although the menstrual cycle is the trigger for PMD, it's not the cause of the condition. So treatment often begins with looking at dietary and lifestyle approaches, as well as considering talking therapies, medications, and in extreme cases, sometimes surgeries. And the focus very much of symptoms management is about changing and altering the brain's kind of reaction to hormonal changes which trigger symptoms. So from a lifestyle point of view, people with PMDD can often have a higher level of chronic inflammation. So dietary recommendations like high fiber, plant-rich diets can be effective due to the impact on things like gut health, blood sugar regulation, and the way the body kind of deals with the breakdown products of hormones. So that can sometimes make a difference for people. It's not necessarily going to manage symptoms for everybody. Talking therapies, so we think around the psychological impact of PMDD, things like cognitive behavioural therapy are recommended therapies. So the NHS may choose to refer somebody for talking therapy services, and we hear from many people to say that that has actually really helped support them. There are medications, so things like antidepressants. Often that's the first recommended medical treatment if we think around the kinds of symptoms people are experiencing. But that may be something that's taken daily, or it may be just taken during that luteal phase. And this is where a good conversation with a healthcare practitioner to understand what might be the right thing for an individual. Some supplements, as I say, recommended checking things like B6, calcium, vitamin D, magnesium. We talked before about anemia and iron levels, all of those things that we're making sure there is nothing else that's going on that's causing some of these symptoms. And then in some cases, surgeries like oophorectomy or hysterectomy may be considered. And as I say, people from the BBC video shared how they felt that surgery has genuinely saved their lives. But when
Yeah,
we think about that, some of those treatment options are quite big decisions.
yeah.
Somebody having a hysterectomy, there are things like GnRH analogs can push people into medically induced or surgically induced menopause. So there are some big decisions. So it's really important people really think about those questions of asking, why are you recommending this treatment? What are the other alternatives? What are the side effects? What are the implications? And then making that informed decision on whether that's the right option.
Absolutely. And Sally, I can see there are so many questions in chat. I think you've answered them all. Not necessarily in the order that they came through, but you've answered them all. But actually, on reflection, whenever I'm speaking to and listening to the team that go out and do the menstruation sessions, there is so much unknown in
Yeah.
terms of the space, in terms of research, in terms of pathways, that actually there's so much required. But we can't wait for all of that to be done. We need to be helping ourselves.
Absolutely. And just one other thing from a self-help point of view, in the PMDD project resources, there is a great little toolkit around coping strategies, personal coping strategies. And this has been written by people with PMDD. And it's a really great resource to be able to access to look at things like, they do talk about building a toolkit, a toolbox for tough days. So things that you can practically that might work for each individual differently, but actually what are those things that we can do to really take care of ourselves during that second half of the menstrual cycle where things may feel more challenging and more difficult.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to say thank you, Sally, and thank you to everybody for the questions that are coming through. Yes, this session is always recorded and we send on the notes. So I think the only one that we didn't answer is, are there any good apps for tracking periods?
There are lots around, I hear of things like Flow. I'm trying to think of any other ones that I've heard of. It's whatever works for you. If you just go into your app store and just put in period trackers, the big challenge with period trackers is it can track symptoms, but one of the big things for PMDD is using something like a diary or a journal to really make sure you're putting across the impact this is having, because I think that's really important that we don't just think about this as just a list of symptoms. It's how is this making you feel, that I say that quote from somebody around, how they feel during those different times of the month. It's really important that that's got across in any conversation with a healthcare practitioner to recognize the impact this is having. And that's really important. But I think the key message just to leave people with is that you're not alone in this. Do reach out and ask for help and support if you're experiencing those severe symptoms. And access the resources, learn as much as possible. And for those that aren't necessarily experiencing this themselves, think about what you can do to raise awareness in your organisation. How can you share information about PMDD so this doesn't become all this stops becoming that taboo subject, the conversations we don't have. So actually people understand, if you say PMDD to them, they know what it is and they know how it might be affecting someone.
That's absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to ask everybody, is this will you join us in this conversation? Because, when you think about helping women thrive, in work and in life. I know many of us have seen the paper from CIPD and the Society of Occupational Medicine and the events that we've already done with those people. So, it is up to us to change this conversation. And so I'd say thank you very much, Sally Leech, and to the Henpicked community for having this conversation with us. And please do keep that conversation going. And so until next time, when actually very shortly we'll be doing early menopause again on the 16th of July. So I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
Thank you.